Welcome to this show, Happy Birthday America, to celebrate America's 250th birthday on the 4th of July. We've got a selection of works of artists we've shown over the years, and they're all post-war. We have ones from the New York area, Chicago, Cleveland, New Orleans, from North and South California. I think it's a fun way of saying happy birthday. So we'll start with the oldest of the artists, who is Seligmann, who was born in Basel in 1900. His parents were involved in furniture design. He then married a cousin of the Wildensteins. Maybe his main problem was that he had money. So whenever anybody wanted to buy a work of his, he'd say, buy one from my friend Max or whatever. He was one of the earlier ones to go to America. He was an expert on black magic. This is one that called Pierrot, and from 1961, and here is Pierrot holding the moon. So sometimes he was called Pierrot de la Lune. And he was a major member of the Surrealist group and an extraordinary painter. We'll go to Chicago, and this is Ed Paschke, who, although he wasn't actually a member of the Harry Who, he was contemporaneous with them, and we've shown him once or twice, and I think he's really extraordinary painter, and I think he taught Jeff Koons. Anyway, Jeff Koons was responsible for him having a show at Gagosian a number of years ago. But I think that, the technique of spray paint and everything, his earlier ones are more painterly, the later ones are more painterly with spray, but they're still extraordinary paintings. Cleveland. This is Julian Stanczak, who was a Polish refugee via Siberia, Iran, Uganda, and London, and then landed up in Cleveland. He didn't want to go to New York. He had his first sort of show with Martha Jackson in 1964. It was when his work was what coined the phrase op art. And then he was one of the largest exhibitors at the Responsive Eye, the famous show at MoMA in 1966. On his flight out of Poland to Siberia, he lost the use of his right hand, although he was right-handed. So all the work is actually made by stenciling. Stencil with one hand. He didn't have studio assistants, and cut it out, and then he would, in this case it's quite simple, he just made one stencil. So you paint the background, the dark color, and then laid down the stencil which left the white out, and then he just painted the white. But sometimes it gets very, very complicated. But it's extraordinary to think what you can do when it's not your art, when you're using the other arm of your hand. Then we have Richard Stankiewicz. Didn't do a lot of sculptures, and he was in a number of shows. I think he was in the Stockholm with Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg and this and that. He was in every major collection in the late 50s, early 60s. This is from 61, and I think he's one of the most exciting junk artists. Cornell. This is a box with a number of Medici symbols in it. The beetle is in their crest, the owl, then there are the Medici people, then they have 5 bulls in their crest, and then the lion. So this one has the story of the Medicis from the early 50s. So now we go to California. Bruce Conner with Wally Hedrick, George Herms is really the sort of Beat Generation, whatever. Conner's films are extraordinary, and I love his work. I always loved his work. We have shown him in sort of Chamberlain and Herms and Stankiewicz in mixtures to do with junk and everything. Wesselmann, one of the kings of pop. This painting was in the first show of Dick Bellamy's Green Gallery and was bought by Bill Burden, who left most of his collection to the Museum of Modern Art, including great Seurat, Brancusi, Gorky. And this one is particularly interesting because it has, as the photo you made, you have a television here, a still photograph of a happening that he made, and the original video of it, or whatever, it was organized by Oldenburg, is in the archives of the Whitney Museum. So you have Tom and his wife Claire, you have Patty Oldenburg, Capro, Oldenburg, Samaras, and then people keep changing their minds who that is. But what I love about this painting is that you have real screws here and a painted knob, and then you have this extraordinary all-American Sundays lined up as a still life. So it's and then in the sort of book, I think Feigen published on the history of art, there's one page for every artist, and this is the one that's in that. Billy Apple, who was from New Zealand originally, born Barry Bates. He had the last Thursday of November in 1962, he was having dinner with Dick Smith, and they decided he was going to change his name. And unfortunately, the bit of paper with all the suggested names is lost. But they came up with Billy Apple. He didn't realize it was actually Thanksgiving in America the day he did it, and that he was going to go to America the next year. He was one of the first people to use neon incorporated as a work as art. He did a small series here called The Presidential Suite. He was invited by Xerox. They'd invented a new printing process similar to really what silkscreen. So this is 1964. Andy had started doing silkscreen a little earlier, but this is sort of his idea of that. But he had a girlfriend who was in the fabric business. So these aren't painted, these are actually fabrics he got from his girlfriend. I find this one is very funny, of Johnson and Humphrey at an LBJ barbecue, where you've got LBJ sort of looking at, sort of to his left occasionally at Humphrey, wondering who the hell is he? You know, they don't seem to be getting on too well. But obviously Humphrey delivered some states he needed. An artist I love, Wally Hedrick, who really is from the Beat generation. He's just had a sort of retrospective show in LA shared between the Box, which is sadly closed, and Sam Parker's gallery. This is from the 60s, and I think these are really, from the 80s. And I think he really is as good as any of the other 80s. Saint Teresa in Ecstasy, with a sort of reference to St. Catherine. But it's extraordinary painting. He was married to J. DeFeo, and the great curator, one of the greatest ones of all time, recent times, Walter Hopps, was desperately in love with J. DeFeo, but it was unrequited. Because of that, he refused to put anything to do with Wally in any of his shows, which was rather sad because everybody would have gained by that. He was violently anti-war and things like that, so there was a series of anti-Vietnam paintings and then anti-Iraq paintings, which had basically taken earlier painting he painted and painted over black. He's really an artist people should look at more. A great George Herms that we bought from the estate of Dennis Hopper. Dennis was a great supporter of George. George died sadly the other day. He was probably the last original hippie. So you can see with sort of how Stankiewicz and Connell and there's a whole real relationship to it. Paul Thek, this is a self-portrait. I don't know if it's a cigarette or a pencil there, but it's rather charming. We got that from his boyfriend at the time. So it's this sort of probably an ivory or wooden crucifixion goes rather well with St. Teresa and the Wally, and there's a sort of a good relationship between this and this wheel. So, we try and curate things to make enjoyable comparisons. Then we have a little run of some of the great LA artists of the 60s. This is Billy Al Bengston, who always sort of like beaten up metal and things. This is a beautiful Joe Goode, who sadly died again last year, I think. He did these beautiful skies, and often sort of, he has a torn up postcard. One's never quite sure what was in the postcard, but it's a beautiful bit of painting, and you feel really represents LA. And he showed with Nick Wilder, who was one of the great dealers in the West Coast, and a really beautiful Ken Price, who was one of the major ceramicists of the late 60s. And this one, the eggs, were sort of one of his most famous motifs, a very beautiful one. One of the most famous of the slightly older generation, Californian Ed Kienholz. This is a later one. Nancy and he did this piece, but it's very funny. He and Walter Hopps were the founders of the Ferris Gallery, and which was extraordinarily important in the late 50s, early 60s in LA. John Tweddle was from Kentucky, I think. He came to New York in the very late 60s, was taken up by Bob Scull and Dick Bellamy, and he came to New York as a very angry young man from that hillbilly type background. Our next show is going to be larger paintings that came from the Scull collection. His father was a trucker, so you sort of, when you see the later work, the ones in the next show, these could be highways and trucks going along it. At the time, the Tremaines and the Philip Johnson and everybody collected his work, and then he left New York in the early 70s as an angry young man. What he's doing now, if you think this is nearly 70 years old, it is so fresh. If it was done by a young person today, people would be amazed. Roy Ferdinand, New Orleans, who was involved in gang culture and everything and got into trouble, somebody said to him, well, why don't you just paint what's going on around you? And so he did, and they're really poignant and sad, and you really do see the other side of New Orleans or America, the sadness and the uselessness. I don't know if this is drug paraphernalia or what. Robert Mallary, who landed up in the upstate Massachusetts, he'd poisoned himself with all the fumes making these pieces, and was told that he couldn't live close to about 75 miles from a major conurbation. He was one of the people that Philip Johnson chose for the World's Fair. He did I think it's called Cliffhanger, needs some restoration, but hopefully one day. Was a great friend of Wayne Thiebaud, and in fact, Mallary introduced Alan Stone, from whom we bought this piece, to Thiebaud, and so Alan took on Thiebaud as well as having taken on Mallary, and in fact one of Thiebaud's daughters is called Mallary after Bob's work here. Then when he went up to upstate Massachusetts, everybody thought that he was dead, but in fact he then became one of the first major computer artists. His work is extraordinary. He had quite a long affair with de Kooning's wife, and so he was down in New Mexico at one stage. So, he's an artist that he again was in 16 Americans and rather disappeared, but wrongly so, but I think they're really extraordinary. Then we have two little pieces here. This is Bob Graham, very well-known LA sculpture. He did, when the previous Olympic Games were in LA, he did the gates for them. So we're 2 years early in showing this for the next Olympics. And then the last piece is Robert Watts, who he showed in the Whitney, and he was in the famous supermarket show at Bianchini. But this is a sort of BLT. So this is a sort of a nice little walk around America. And I hope you all have a chance to see it. Fun and vibrant. When it comes by, happy birthday, America, next month. Thank you.